I'm so excited, Sherry. I read this and wow, this is different than your first book.
Very different. Yeah.
But I love that. I've said this to a couple people now. I'm tired of reading Cal Newport's books. I love his ideas. I listen to his podcast, but every book is like between 220 and 240 pages. And he stamps it out. And then 2 years later, he writes another book of 220 to 240 pages. And he does a little excerpt in the New Yorker, but it's the same formula, and I'm bored with it. Some
Mm,
topics deserve 500 pages, some deserve 4 pages. Go with what the topic deserves.
I get it. Yeah. But I'm glad it was a good read for you. I'm glad it spoke to you.
I want to start though, which is why'd you write Mummy Eaters and who'd you write it for?
I suppose I was trying to understand my Coptic heritage, and I wanted to get at the link between Coptic Christians and their ancient Egyptian roots. So I wanted to understand the context historically as well in light of colonialism. And I wanted to move closer to my grandmothers, neither of whom learned to read, and my great aunt. She did learn how to read, but my two grandmothers didn't. They're all gone now, but the ultimate answer to your question, the target audience, is probably me, which I think is probably the target audience for most writers. But I write to figure out what I'm thinking, as I'm sure you do. And I'm always endlessly grateful if any of it translates to other people's life experiences.
You explained it a little bit in the very beginning of the book, but why the title, Mummy Eaters?
Okay, so this refers to a practice, a gruesome practice in the 16th and 17th centuries, when Europeans would eat Egyptian human remains, so mummies, for medicinal purposes. There is this conception that Europeans were civilized in a way that the rest of the world wasn't. So I just wanted to highlight the maybe uncivil and barbaric ways that native Egyptians, alive, dead, were treated. It's a little bit of a study on civility, but the mummification process that the ancient Egyptians used was very reverent, it was thoughtful, it was deliberate, it was formulaic, but the way that the remains were dug up and used wasn't. And I wanted to just lightly sketch this question that perhaps incivility existed because they weren't seen as being human,
Mhm.
which I think we're going to get to later, but that was the reason for the title.
You mentioned the mummification process being ritualized. I can't remember if you used this word, but I got the sense of sacred. And I think I may have mentioned to you that I just took this class on the story that I'd never heard of before until I took the class called The Tale of Sinuhe from
Mhm.
what 1900 or so BC. It dates a long time ago, but it's very clear in this tale that Sinuhe. So the idea is he leaves Egypt under weird circumstances, but he's very keen on getting back for the end of his life and for his mummification and burial. And in fact, the tale is told from the perspective of he is already dead. He has died already, and he's telling this tale. And I think Sinue is a very interesting character. I don't think I'm not necessarily sure that what is what to get and you get in everything he writes. But to me, it's very clear that he is sincere about wanting to get back. That's an important thing for him. The place of Egypt and burial in Egypt is critical for him. And I'm just interested in your view. In Mummy Eaters, the land of Egypt is hugely important. The mummification process is hugely important. You write about Egypt as sacred soil, about its desecration from that sacredness. And I want to hear from you about the importance of Egypt as a place, as a sacred place for humanity, but also for you.
Yeah. So Egypt is the land of my ancestors, right? And I was born in Cairo. I've been back since then multiple times since immigrating to the United States, but it doesn't, I think, belong to me in the same way that it would potentially belong to my cousins who still live there. In some sense, the immigrant experience is very different than living in a place, but it still feels like the place that I came from. There is this curiosity that's born of distance
Hmm.
and a desire to understand where my people came from, the land that nurtured my ancestors. But In some broader sense, I think ancient Egypt belongs to the world, to humanity. Mummy Eaters has been my way of starting to understand this incubator of culture, spirituality, human intelligence that was ancient Egypt and carried forth into modern times. Did I answer the question?
Yeah, and it brings me back to a line of question that I started with about some of the mechanics of writing it.
Yeah.
You answered a little bit there about why you wrote it, but tell us a little bit more about that. Why did you write it? As I read it, I get it. Like every author, when I write something, I have a purpose. I get it. But tell me your purpose in this, and also talk a little bit more about some of the mechanics. Like, how long did it take from your first idea of this to getting the manuscript done? Tell us a little bit about that.
Process, this was very different for me, Russell. So this book took me by surprise. I normally write at a glacial pace, and this is not unrelated to the fact that I have three small boys. But this book was finished in about 6 months, which is lightning fast for me.
Yeah.
So this book wanted to be written. There's something that was urgent about this book. And I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, that I wanted to understand. I think there was something that I wanted to untangle about where my family came from. So it was a very urgent writing process. Very
Huh.
different than the novel, for instance, that took 5 years.
Pull on that thread a little bit more, Sherry. What do you think you were trying to unravel or understand?
I think at its root, I wanted to get at the issue of the sort of the sins that we commit against each other, the ways that we commit violence against each other, and
Hmm.
what it means as somebody who's slightly removed from that violence, what it means to forgive. Because nothing was done to me directly, right? I didn't have my tongue cut out for speaking Coptic. My remains were not exhumed and consumed. I did not directly experience colonization or theft. But I guess some of this was me trying to grapple with this question of what is the statute of limitations on something that happened to your ancestors in the past? How long does generational trauma continue? And
Hmm.
is it okay to even call it that? And also at the same time, I wanted to work on this parallel storyline. So in the beginning of the book, one of the descendants of this pharaoh, Akhenaten, is being mummified, right? And so it follows also her journey into the afterlife. To make it more real, I think that we dug people up, but they were actually people and consumed them. But what it meant spiritually for them to bury their dead and to preserve them, and why it mattered to have the body, why the incarnate, the human person mattered, why the physical body mattered. Because sometimes in modern times, sometimes we incinerate our dead. We don't have the same reverence for the body of the dead that they did. So I wanted to understand some of that as well. And I think in the seed of understanding their reverence for the dead is the answer to why resurrection was so important to them.
Hmm.
Because the body itself was really important. In the incarnation, I think is the seed of what eventually becomes resurrection for them,
Hmm.
which is the afterlife, which is their version of what we would think of as heaven. Um, I don't know if that gets a little bit more at your question.
Yeah.
Than,
And in ancient Egypt, here it, if this is a coherent question, we will have exhausted my knowledge about ancient Egypt, but it seems like the pharaohs were seen as an incarnation of the gods and the queen, but the royalty was the incarnate God, and they very much saw the things of the world and the key people of the world as the incarnate gods. Is that what you're speaking to in terms of the sort of incarnation of the holy, the sacred, and the resurrection of everyone's bodies plays a role in the sacred cycle, and
yeah,
mummification was a very important part of that, carrying forth and completing the cycle, right?
yes. And you can see that in the story of Osiris. It's very cyclic. His body needed to be recovered to be resurrected,
Yeah,
essentially, to be brought back. They were very reverent about the human body.
interesting. They were reverent about the human body. they were also reverent about the place, the land. The name of Egypt is holy. And that love of Egypt, the land, the place, is evident in mummy eaters. And you and I have talked about Wendell before, but a reverence that people should maybe have for a place.
Yes.
Talk to us about that, not just the holiness and the sacredness of the human body is related to the divine, but also this place, Egypt, as sacred and holy, and in some sense, distinct from other places. I don't want to say the divine plan. That doesn't seem quite right, but you were born there, but you haven't lived there continually. You still feel a very powerful connection with it. And I know your family does too. Talk to me about the specialness, the holiness, the sacredness of this place, Egypt.
Is it sacred compared to anywhere else? I think all the land is sacred, but in the beginning, in the very first poem, is called Sunflowers of Fukushima. It's an invocation. There's this back and forth between speaking and silencing throughout the book, right? It's supposed to paint this picture about this actually happened in Japan, from my understanding. The land that was affected by nuclear fallout, nothing could grow there. But what one monk did, Monk Koyu Abe, he planted a field of sunflower seeds and basically pulled up the radiation, the toxicity that was in the soil. And so that was my sort of prayer for the book, was maybe pull up some of the toxicity that had been sown throughout time, whether it was through colonization, whether through desecration of human remains, or Egypt's been conquered so many times, Russell, so many different times in different ways. And I think to pull up the toxicity from my own experience of it, but also from my own generation's experience of it too, because we have to process grief in order to grow from it. In some sense, to get at your initial question, I feel like all land is sacred. I don't know that Egypt is more sacred than any other place, but I think some of the sacredness of the land is the way that we treat it too. And because Egypt has been defiled so many times, this was also my way of just processing, maybe pulling up some of the toxicity that I have come to associate with the land. Because Egypt is a very fertile country. The Nile River Valley and the area right around the Nile is some of the most fertile land, right, in Africa. And what happened initially is the Egyptian government would let people in modern times build on what used to be farm ground. And then they realized, oh, this was the place where we used to let the Nile flood, and it would bring this intensely rich soil up and allow us to grow in the middle of the desert. But now they don't do that. We have a dam, right? And not only do we have a dam, but we also build on top of that land. They've realized that since, and now you can't build on what is essentially for farmland. But yeah, the way that we treat the land has a lot to do with the sacredness of the land. And so if you build on farmland, if you don't allow the Nile to flood, and we have people that live there, so we can't let it flood, but those decisions have consequences. And yeah, I think that that goes back to the sacredness of the land, the way that we dump on it, the way that we treat it, desecrate it.
It gets at something else that at least I perceived in the book, which is you talk a lot about love is very clearly a theme, and we'll talk even more about it. But you were just talking about desecration. A lot of the love in this book is love that's gone awry, love of the wrong thing. The mummy eaters, it is people in the 16th and 17th century loving a certain kind of life, a certain kind of health, but thereby desecrating something else. It's a love gone awry. Talk to me a little bit about the theme of love as you see it in the book and how love goes awry, how it goes wrong, and how it goes wrong when it's not directed at the right object.
In the Coptic Orthodox tradition, we believe that humans bear the image of God. And if God is love, a lack of love distorts the image, right? So in order for us to do violence to each other, and across the spectrum, you have verbal internet abuse on one end towards strangers, all the way to genocide, all the violence that we commit. I think we have to dehumanize people in order to do that. So love humanizes, a lack of love distorts the true image. And the Copts believe that God spoke the world into existence in love. So in this series, Silencing the poems, I tried to explore the way that we silence each other. And I think at its root, the issue is when we silence, we deny the other people's humanity. And it makes it really easy to commit violence against them, to erase them. Whatever nefarious thing that we're going to do becomes much easier. Once we've removed their ability to speak, removed love from the equation.
Let's talk about a kind of love that you carve out as special in the book. You seem to carve out family love between a grandmother and a mother and a daughter. You especially emphasize that in the book, and it has a special emphasis in the book. And as I read it, a special grace. It appears as an unbreakable, incorrigible, incorruptible kind of love. Why do you single out this kind of love between a grandmother, a mother, and a daughter?
I think there's a sacredness in the love passed down from my grandmothers. This is just my experience, of course. It was broad, it was deep, and it felt unconditional. So it didn't ask for anything. It was a very feeding, nurturing kind of love. A lot of the love that my grandmothers showed was through food, which is a lot of people's experience. But I feel, Russell, that there's nothing you can do in the face of that kind of love other than to receive it. You just bear it somehow. It's like squinting into the sun. But the love between mothers and daughters is a little bit more complicated. I've been abundantly blessed in my mother, but the love passed down from my grandmothers, that's just different. It's been my experience has been just a very
Yeah.
different one. It doesn't ask anything.
Yeah. Can't remember who said it, but oh man, that's gonna drive me nuts all night that I can't think of who it is, but says that the wonderful thing about being with a grandmother is just being with the grandmother.
Yes, that's true.
You know?
Yeah, it's just this sense of this presence. They're with you in a way that's very different.
Yeah.
They,
Yeah.
they don't want anything from you.
Yeah. Let me go back to this theme of mummification and this cycle of incarnation and renewal. You write a lot about the dead recognizing themselves so that they can attain the afterlife. But to me, you very clearly relate that almost to a sense of us modern humans not not recognizing ourselves. There's something missing in our identity. There's something we are not recognizing in ourselves. What are you saying there? What's missing in how we identify ourselves today?
So, mummification was about maintaining the physical integrity of the body so that the dead could recognize themselves in the afterlife, right? In a sense, they're just buying some time to slow down decay long enough for that soul to recognize itself. So I think in a similar sense, being truly alive is also about maintaining integrity, mental integrity, spiritual integrity. I think being integral, that word, means to me to be truly human, truly among the living. I found the physical integrity in mummification a really beautiful parallel for that. And then also regarding the issue of integrity, there is a lot of scholarly speculation about this pharaoh that's mentioned, Akhenaten. He was called a heretic pharaoh, right, for adopting a monotheistic worldview. Some say it was like a political power move. Others said he was just plain mad. But I wanted to maybe explore another possibility that hey, maybe he truly believed it. Maybe he thought that there was a single God and he tried to have some integrity about it. Maybe that was the arc of his life. So, of course, it's all speculation, but it was an interesting thought experiment for me. What would it look like if you were God on earth, as the Pharaoh was, and you had integrity? They probably killed him. We don't know exactly what happened, but what does integrity look like? The physical integrity of mummification, in my mind, was a parallel for what does integrity look like? How do we recognize ourselves? How do we live with ourselves? How do we sleep at night? What does it look like to do those things?
You're Coptic. This brings us very close to Christianity and the story of Christianity of Jesus who knew he was God and did something about it.
Yeah. And was killed for it.
It was killed for it. Maybe I missed it, or maybe I misinterpreted something. But as I read the book, I I saw a lot about the religion of ancient Egypt, and I saw a lot of parallels that, in my, again, very shallow understanding of Coptic and Orthodox Christianity, one thing that I didn't notice a lot of was Islam. There's one minor reference to it in the very end of the book.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. It was largely a function of the timeline, Russell. So Coptic Egypt predates Islam, but I don't think you can have a real conversation about modern Egypt without addressing Coptic Muslim relationships. So my attempt at that was the poem toward the end about Arabic later in the book. And it's about the things that really matter between two people groups that have to coexist, but
Yeah.
have very different understanding of truth. So you're not talking about different beliefs about something that doesn't matter. These are conflicting ideas about what is true, but what actually matters when you have that sort of tension. So that poem was my way of trying to address that.
Gotcha. Okay.
And in case people don't ever get to read that poem, it outlines a moment in time where my mom woke after surgery. They thought she was going to die. She had a really bad abscess. She was unable to take care of her baby. She almost lost her life. My dad was across the ocean. And her Muslim sisters took her call shifts and divvied them up. And one of them was sitting by her bedside just chanting from the Quran when she woke.
Yeah.
And I was hoping that image would convey my understanding of what's important between Copts and Muslims. It goes on a little bit longer, but I think that's the most important portion.
So I'm glad you said that because I didn't quite pick up on that. I just don't think I picked up on that being the image. No, I appreciate that.
And it also ends because there's so much silencing in the book, dealing with silencing. And it also ends with, what if instead of giving airtime to the haters, essentially, we could just chant of God in whatever tongue that's left to us, in case somebody doesn't ever get a chance to read that.
That's great. Another theme of the book is possession. Who owns what? I mean, who owns the mummies? Who owns Egyptian heritage? You said earlier, in some sense, ancient Egypt belongs to humanity, to the world. The heritage of that belongs to the world. You seem to have views on who owns Egyptian land, Egyptian language, the treasures of Egypt. So who does own them and who should own them? I'm coming with the easy question, Sherry. One softball after the other. Just one
Yeah.
softball after the other. You know?
So much has been stolen from Egypt, Russell, from Ghana, from China, from Greece. The list is embarrassingly long, right? There's a British Museum Act that makes it functionally illegal to remove objects unless they're duplicated or damaged or not any longer part of the public interest. But sometimes we complicate things. People talk about how displaying things in encyclopedic museums allows the quote world to access them. Not everyone has access, right? And these objects were acquired legitimately, etc., they say, when really it's simple. We shouldn't keep things that don't belong to us. So whether we knew at the time that something was stolen or not doesn't change the fact that it was stolen. That argument actually would never hold up in a US court, right? Sorry, officer or judge, I didn't know it was stolen. No, it was stolen and you had it. So I think the fact remains that a lot of these items were stolen, whether through ignorance of the person that took them initially or not. But in Egyptian artifacts aren't subtle, Russell. You don't look at them and wonder if they were Egyptian. They had a brand. So, obviously Egyptian, maybe the origin is not under question. I understand there are arguments for keeping objects in other museums I don't think all of the treasures of ancient Egypt belong in the Egyptian Museum. I think that it's fair to share some things. What is it in the Metropolitan Museum of Art? There's like have you seen it?
I don't think I have seen it, but I know what you're talking about.
It's like they just picked it up and moved it. I think there's a joke that the only reason the pyramids are still in Egypt is because they were too heavy to move. So I understand it's a complicated question. The more I think complicated question is how would you do that? What do reparations look like? That I think maybe above my pay grade, but I think when something is stolen, we should at least acknowledge it as being stolen. I think also displaying human remains may not be necessary. I understand that people are interested in what mummies look like, and I think it's okay to show images of that, but I don't know that the remains need to be in museums forever. I wonder if there would be a more reverent way to deal with human remains than the way we're doing that now.
We don't typically show modern human remains. We don't have famous bodies on display.
Nope.
Come
We
check
put them in
out,
the ground.
you
Yeah.
know,
We
famous
allow them to.
player or cricket player or baseball player. Come see Ted Williams, the splendid splinter on display here at this museum on a world tour.
Yeah. The question of reparations is very complicated and how you would do that and how much, but stolen is stolen in some sense.
Let me tie a couple themes that we've been talking about together and just ask you how they relate for you and how they relate in the book. But we've talked about possession and we've talked about identity. And clearly, the Venn diagram is not a perfect overlap. Some things that are not possessed by Egyptians are still Egyptian. You feel Egyptian, you are Egyptian, even though you're not in Egypt. Tell me about your thoughts about how possession and identity are or are not related in our modern world.
That's a good question. Where to start? Maybe I can get at that from a different angle. The issue of possession and identity. Can we put a pin in that one and come back? I feel like maybe from a different angle, I might be able to tackle that.
Yeah. Let me ask this, which is I just want to nerd out with you for a few questions. Like I read this. I'll show you. I'm trying to think if there's a really good page where I'm like, okay, like I have 5 things circled here, and I'm like, I don't know any of these things. I have no idea what they are. So I think you've written a real, to me, intellectual tour de force. I think I counted 83 things that I circled. Terms I didn't know, people I didn't know, locations I didn't know, terms I didn't understand. And I love that. I love stretching and learning and being confronted with things that I don't know and therefore I'm not comfortable with. And this was a book very much in that vein for me. A lot of things that I had not confronted or thought about, and that was themes, and that was just words. And I like that. Did you simply know all these references kind of off the top of your head and you're doing your writing groove thing? Or did you also have to look these things up and research and study some things and think more about them and look for connections? Talk to me just a little bit about that because I could have existed in my current state life for another 500 years and I never could have written this.
Thank you, Russell. I do a ton of research. So no, the answer to your question is no. I didn't know all those things. I do a lot of research. So like you, I love to read and I learn and force myself out of my comfort zones when I can. So in writing this book, I went to a lot of primary sources. I think I put some of them in the back, but I think I list a number of them. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means. This is nothing. So I read a ton, but also there was a lot of oral history. So I sat with my dad quite a bit. My dad is a wonderful oral historian. He's the keeper of a lot of the memories that are still available. You know, there's so much that's lost even in a single generation. The things that my dad knows that I don't. So a lot of it is oral history, but I did go to a ton of primary resources as well to try and expand my knowledge.
That's wonderful. I love many things about this book. That was one of them that, like I said, it forced me to just look up and learn so many things I didn't know before, and that brought into view many themes I hadn't really thought about before. That was wonderful.
Go back, Russell, to something you had asked me earlier.
Yes.
So you had asked about self-recognition.
Yeah.
So I had mentioned, we had talked earlier about this series of silencing poems and that we have to dehumanize the other in order to be violent towards them. I wanted to add a little bit to that. I think silencing, because it denies the humanity of the person in front of us, there's a spectrum of silencing in the book. But I wanted to especially highlight the kind of casual silencing, the thoughtless, the ways we don't intend to silence, but we simply didn't care enough maybe to understand, and the harm that's done that way. So in pediatrics, I'm a pediatrician, the most common form of child abuse is neglect.
Mm.
It's just not providing what's necessary. So mistranslation is the beginning of silencing in many ways. So denying people language, mispronouncing their names, it seems really innocuous, right? But I was trying to give a glimpse in the book of how catastrophic a mistranslation could be. So my great aunt Marie, for instance, it's mentioned very briefly, but she had a pacemaker placed in her chest without her consent. She was sent a Spanish speaking interpreter. She speaks Arabic, and it's amazing, right? But the title of the book also really points to the mistranslation of the word mummy. In the Persian, they referred to medicinal bitumen, which is a kind of viscous material, plant material can be. But you could argue that mummy eating would never have occurred if not for that mistranslation. And in the same vein, if we don't neglect one another with respect to the spoken word, we wouldn't end up with these figurative consumptions. So we figuratively consume each other, just being neglectful. And then there's the rest of the spectrum, of course, of silencing, the deliberate kinds, the obvious ones, the violence. But I wanted to just highlight the really seemingly innocuous ones too.
Sometimes I wonder if the innocuous things come about not from bad faith or malfeasance, but a confrontation with another that you just don't know what to do with. There is that language barrier. There is the inability to actually communicate, and you're still left in a place where you have to act and you just don't know what to do. I have, as a total armchair general, studied war for 25 years or longer. And I never understood why people actually went to war until I went to Korea and I didn't understand a single word. And for some reason, being immersed in that environment, I understood misunderstanding in a way I hadn't before. That leads to a very slippery slope, what you were saying earlier, of it being very easy to dehumanize what you can't understand.
Yeah, and sometimes I think of a very simple example when someone is hurting, like after a death in the family, for instance. Sometimes that person is suffering because they're lonely, but people just don't know what to say. So it's a type of mistranslation, it's a miscommunication. Really, they want presence, they want someone to show up or just be there physically, maybe not even say anything at all. But there's almost a language barrier in a sense, and it can cause harm because that person is then isolated and is grieving alone. But just as a very everyday example. And then, of course, there's the actual language barrier when you are dealing with a totally different culture or place that you couldn't actually speak the language.
I wonder if we're isolating ourselves more and more. I am not the first observer of this. I happen to be traveling this week, which is pretty rare for me, but I went to breakfast in the hotel restaurant, and every single person except for me was on their phone. So they're at a meal, they're at a, by definition, communal event.
Yes.
They are disengaged. They are isolating themselves. They are not with or attempting to create community or even confrontation with the other. It's a real bubble, and it was strange to be the solo person there, but the least isolated person in that environment.
I feel like we could talk for another hour about that. There's definitive data now that depression, anxiety worsen. You get more depression and anxiety, especially in children, when they're on phones and social media. There's a book that I recently read called The Anxious Generation. But the charts are they're really damning. It's terrifying what's coming if we can't get a hold of this, because we already have an epidemic of loneliness. It's going to worsen. And the more we isolate ourselves, the less we can communicate with each other. We're coming up on an election, and some of the issues that we have are just massive miscommunications. We can't sit with somebody who doesn't believe the same thing we do. We think of differences in opinion as being violence, and they're not necessarily violence. They're differences in opinion that can be potentially sorted if we could sit down and communicate properly. But communication is a bit of a lost art right now. And I think it has a lot to do with what you're saying. People are in their own little world. We don't look up from our screens. And we don't read. I feel like if we read more novels, maybe we would be in a better place. Or talk to each other. The book we were talking about earlier, A Month in the Country, a wonderful book. I just feel like there's so much truth conveyed in that, 140 pages.
Yeah.
It's incredible. And you can be a more tolerant person potentially after reading it.
Yeah.
I won't give anything away.
That's totally right. I'm reading Boswell's Life of Johnson, which I've read before, and it's wonderful. Life of Samuel Johnson. And I interviewed a gentleman named Henry Oliver, and he and I were nerding out on that. I took a class in Samuel Johnson College, and I forgot how much I loved it. Anyway, what's striking me about the book right now is how wrong Samuel Johnson is in so many things. And yet I see him in a more human light than I did in my first reading 20 years ago. That's been a curious revelation for me for 400 pages in, a little less than halfway through the book. He seems really wrong, but more human.
Yes, and you've experienced grief in those 20 years. You've experienced life and grief. I feel like that makes us more able to bear other people's imperfections.
Suffering is learning. This is the point of the East and Sophocles and so many others. Suffering is learning. All right, while we're on the subject of emotions, so you've written an intellectual tour de force. I think this is also an emotional tour de force in my reading. Like you, it is understated and polite and courteous. And you note that courteousness or that courtesy at the end of the book. That maybe at the end, whatever has happened, we owe each other courtesy. But I found this very emotional nonetheless. This has an edge that your first book, The Lightkeeper, doesn't have. It's very different. And I think it shows disappointment and maybe even a touch of anger. In my margin notes in the book, I wrote, "This exudes an ache, a hurt of generations of centuries." Talk to me about your emotions in writing this book.
So, Russell, writing anything that hurts, which is usually the stuff that matters, requires that we process it. This isn't to say that like raw, unfiltered grief can't be written. I think it can. I think there's a way to do that. But I think in order for it to not be like a diary entry, I think it has to be lived with and processed in some sense. So this was my attempt to be as clear-eyed as I could, and some of the anger still seeps through. So to be as clear-eyed as I could about colonization, its legacy, which in many ways is erasure. So one example off the top of my head, Copts at one point would have their tongues cut off for speaking Coptic, right? So those things might not have happened to me directly, but they did happen to my ancestors. And they do have repercussions today. So the result now is that Coptic is a liturgical language. It's not spoken. In one of the poems, I try to address this issue of seeing a hurt and naming it. So I think there's power, at least in naming the hurt, so that we can acknowledge it, try to forgive and grow, and maybe grow past it, grow from it, grow past it, and thrive. Because I think there's no point in talking about generational trauma if we don't talk about mitigation and thriving. Nobody wants to just exist here and wallow in the past. But I think we all want to live a good, full, healthy life. And forgiveness is a really big part of that. Whether there's anything to forgive or not, whether people think I have anything to forgive, in some sense, these sins were committed against my ancestors. But I think that even their repercussions have to be forgiven. The fact that we don't speak the language of my ancestors or any of the other things, the fact that I can't walk into the museum in Cairo and see something because it was stolen. There are still those things I think that we have to process, and naming them helps, forgiveness helps, and then we can hopefully thrive in the aftermath because we've pulled up the toxicity from the soil.
Like you were talking about earlier at Fukushima.
Yeah.
I love that. This is a weighty book, a serious book, but I got to tell you, in a few instances, I found it gloriously funny. You write this about mummification as like plastic surgery, but the highest stakes nose job of all time. I'm sitting at a pool chair and I'm cracking up reading that line. It was hilarious. And I don't know, Aristotle says that humor is a test of smartness, because you have to create connections to find something humorous. Now, were you trying to be funny? Am I reading that right? Or is that just me in my weird head being
Nope,
like,
you're totally right. No, absolutely. Thank you for finding my humor funny. No, absolutely. I think humor is one of the ways that I process hurt. It's just sometimes it's easier to approach something really serious and not to lessen the gravity of the thing, but to make it processable, for lack of a better way of phrasing that. So I'm glad that parts of it made you laugh. They made me laugh.
I thought it was hilarious. I thought it was brilliant. It's so funny. Let me ask you just a couple last questions. You end the book with a poem titled Letters for My Grandmothers. You write about the special love between grandmothers and granddaughters. What are you saying about ending the book here? You give two different views of femininity in that poem. You talk about an ancient view and you talk about a very modern view. Tell us about the contrast and what you're saying about femininity and why that's so important to end the book that way.
Yeah, so the poem that you're talking about, Letters to My Grandmothers, it starts with a giantess is stirring onions into the 16,425th meal, which is about halfway through a life. But she knows no more of letters than the slanted slash of a signature. So both my grandmothers were illiterate in that sense, but neither of them was any less worthy than I of language, of learning the letters. So in the Coptic tradition, when someone dies, we say, may you live and remember. And I put that in the dedication to my grandmothers at the beginning. Being forgotten, I think, is another form of death. And people die another death when they're forgotten, I think. And so I wanted their memory to carry on. Mummification, as we were saying earlier, is about buying the dead a little bit more time to recognize themselves in the afterlife. And so this book is dedicated to my grandmothers for their really unflinching love to perhaps maybe buy them a little bit more time in remembrance.
Love that. Let me end with this, Sherry. What's next? What are you working on now?
I am about 70% through a novel. When I talk about it out loud, gosh, the target audience is really me. It's about a perfumer in the 1920s in Paris, and he loses his sense of smell. And with it, his memories, because his memories are so tied up in his sense of who he is. It's his journey back to himself through scent. You want to see the pile of books that I've been researching on perfume sitting at the top of my desk. That's just the perfumery section. That's what I'm working on right now. And it's been a wild ride, but
I
it's been
think
fun.
that's brilliant. I can't wait to read that.
Thank you.
I think smell is like the sense that is least well written
Yes.
and thought about. I've read a lot about World War One, and the thing that I can't understand or comprehend is the smell of those trenches.
That is so interesting that you say that, because this man, this perfumer, lives through World War One. There's a whole section where he's remembering the scent of war. There's a perfume forum called Fragrantica, and there's one author on there who does an entire post just on the scents of World War One.
Wow.
It was such an interesting read.
Yeah, the scent of war and death and burning and rotting and the sun.
It was also in some of the primary sources that this person looked into. It was also the scent of stuff that's wet that didn't dry properly. sandbags that didn't dry properly, dead animals, horses in particular.
Yeah.
And then there were the biological weapons that were used, some for the first time, things like bleach. He has a flashback in the story. His wife is cleaning something. But there's this very intense. It'll be interesting to get your feedback actually about it since you're a World War I expert.
I am not a World War One expert. I am an expert in virtually nothing. But I'm going to
Not
take
bad.
that invitation that you might be willing to join me for a third interview after that book comes out and to talk about that book.
I would love to. That would be so much fun.
Amazing. That'd be awesome.
Thank you so much, Russell. You are so kind and generous in your engagement. Honestly, it's such a delight to speak with you. It's every author's dream that someone engage on this level with a work and actually read through it and tab the work and just, it's so special and so generous. Thank you.
No, thank you. I love your writing and I love our conversations. It's all amazing. I learned so much. You give me so much to reflect on and to ponder. And it's always wonderful to see you and to get a chance to talk, Sherry.
Thank you so much, Russell. Hopefully we'll get a chance to chat soon. And I would love to hear your thoughts later when you read A Month in the Country.
I've got to read one book right now that I'm doing a review for, but after that, I will read A Month in the Country. Thank you so much for your time, Sherry. This was awesome. I'm so excited.
My pleasure. And thank you so much, Russell, for your time. I really enjoyed this.